Back in the early 1970s, something unusual rolled out of Volkswagen's Brazilian factory. It was long, low, and sleek, something that looked nothing like a Beetle or a Golf. People in Brazil were used to practical Volkswagens, but this car? This one was trying to be a sports car. It had curves, it had 2 doors, it had pop-up headlights, and a name nobody had heard before, Volkswagen SP2. It was born from a time when Brazil had strict rules about imported cars, which forced companies to get creative. And sometimes, when big companies are pushed into a corner, they come up with strange and interesting ideas. The story began in São Bernardo do Campo, São Paulo, where Volkswagen do Brasil was trying to change its image. They had been building small, reliable cars for years, but in Brazil, a local car company named Puma was making sporty-looking cars that caught people's attention. Volkswagen wanted something to fight back. So, in the late 1960s, a project called Projeto X was started. It was led by Rudolf Leiting, the managing director at the time. He gave the green light to make a Brazilian-designed sports car. The design was done by Marcio Piancastelli along with Jose Vicente Novita Martins and Jorge Yamashita Oba. They did not just slap a new body on an old car. Instead, they used the Volkswagen 1600 variant platform, which was a bit bigger and more stable than a Beetle. They widened the chassis and placed the engine in the back. The result was a car that looked fast, even if it really was not. The SP2 used a 1.7-liter air-cooled flat-4 engine, also known as the pancake engine. It made 65 horsepower at 4,600 revolutions per minute and 89 pound-feet of torque at 3,000 revolutions per minute. That was enough to push the car to a top speed of 100 miles per hour, and it could go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 15 seconds. It was not quick, especially by sports car standards, and that led many Brazilians to joke that SP2 stood for Sem Potência, which means without power. But it was not all about speed. The SP2 did have a lot going on underneath. It used a rear-wheel drive layout, and it had a 4-speed manual transmission. The suspension setup was pretty advanced for the time, with torsion leaf springs and telescopic dampers in the front, and a swing axle with Z-bar and torsion bars in the rear. The brakes were solid, discs at the front and drums at the back. The car handled well enough for normal driving, but it was never a track machine. Inside, the SP2 looked surprisingly modern for the 1970s. It had a full set of gauges, including a tachometer, fuel gauge, oil temperature, and even an ammeter. There were 2 small storage spaces, one in the front that could hold 140 liters, and another behind the seats with 205 liters of space. It also came with 3-point seat belts, which was a big deal in Brazil at the time. Volkswagen even built a version called the SP1, which came with a 1.6-liter engine making 54 horsepower. But that car sold so poorly, only 88 were made, that it was quickly scrapped. A few years later, engineers tried to fix the performance problem by making prototypes called the SP3, which used the 1.6-liter water-cooled engine from the Volkswagen Passat TS. That engine made 85 horsepower, and it helped the SP3 move better, but it never went into full production. A company called Daikin, based in São Paulo, also tried to build a better version of the SP2. Their version, also called the Daikin SP3, used a 1.8-liter water-cooled engine making 100 horsepower. It came with a few design changes and better performance, but it was too expensive, and only a few were ever made. The SP2 was built from 1972 to 1976, with 10,205 units produced. Only 681 were exported, and 155 of those went to Nigeria. That means most SP2s stayed in Brazil, and they are now rare even there. Back in 1973, a German magazine called Hobby called it the most beautiful Volkswagen in the world. That might have been a little much, but people did admire how different it looked from the rest of the brand's lineup. Today, the Volkswagen SP2 is a strange but interesting part of automotive history. It was made during a time when Brazil had to build its own cars, whether or not they were fast. And even though it was not a performance beast, the SP2 proved that even a company like Volkswagen could try something bold, if the rules made them do it. It may not have won many races, but it definitely won some attention. and that is more than you can say for most forgotten sports cars. In the early 1970s, behind the Iron Curtain, while most of the world focused on big car brands from Germany, Italy, or America, something unusual was happening in Czechoslovakia. A small car maker named Skoda, mostly known for making simple, practical cars, rolled out a sleek and sporty coupe that looked like it came from a different world. It was called the Skoda 110R, and it looked fast even when standing still. This was not just a new car, it was a signal that Skoda wanted to do more than just make cars for everyday use. They wanted to have some fun. The story of the Skoda 110R began in 1966. Skoda engineers in Czechoslovakia started working on a sporty two-door coupe, something that could follow up the Skoda 1000 MBX and 1100 MBX. They gave it an internal code name, S7 18K, and began testing prototypes. The first prototype came out in March 1968, and a second one followed in 1969. On September 5, 1970, the final production version was revealed to the public at the engineering fair in Brno. This was a big deal for the country, as sleek sports coupes were not something people in Czechoslovakia saw every day. The Skoda 110R was built at the Kvasiny factory, and it had a rear-engine, rear-wheel drive layout just like many small European cars of that time. But it stood out for its design. It had a fastback roof, frameless doors, and a sloping rear that made it look more modern than most of its rivals. It even had a fake wood dashboard inside, with 5 round gauges and a sporty 2+2 seating layout. Sure, it was not a racing car, but it definitely looked the part. Under the rear hood was a 1,107 cubic centimeter inline-4 engine with overhead valves. It made around 52 horsepower at 4,650 revolutions per minute and produced 63 pound-feet of torque at 3,500 revolutions per minute. The car had a 4-speed manual transmission and could reach a top speed of about 90 miles per hour. It took 18.5 seconds to go from 0 to 62 miles per hour. Not exactly fast, but it got the job done, and it looked good doing it. The Skoda 110R used front disc brakes from Dunlop and rear drum brakes. It rode on Barham 155 SR14 tires. It was just over 163 inches long, 64 inches wide, and stood about 52 inches tall. It weighed around 1,940 pounds, which helped make it more agile than its numbers might suggest. Though it was designed for the road, the 110R quickly became the base for Skoda's racing cars. First came the Skoda 180 RS and Skoda 200 RS in 1974. These had bigger overhead cam engines, 1.8-liter and 2.0-liter, and used 5-speed gearboxes from Porsche. These cars could hit speeds over 130 miles per hour and were built with lightweight materials like aluminum and fiberglass. Skoda engineers were serious about racing. Then came the most famous version, the Skoda 130 RS in 1975. This car kept the rear engine setup but used a 1.3-liter engine, making up to 140 horsepower. It won its class at the 1977 Monte Carlo Rally and earned the nickname Porsche of the East. That title might sound like a stretch, but the 130 RS did embarrass a few Western cars on the rally stages. The Skoda 110R had a price of about 78,000 Czechoslovak crowns, which made it expensive for many locals. But the car did very well in export markets. By 1973, 93% of all 110R cars were sold outside the country. Between 1970 and 1980, Skoda built a total of 57,085 units before ending production. Its replacement came in the form of the Skoda Guard and later the Skoda Rapid, which continued the tradition of rear-engine coupes. Today, the Skoda 110R is remembered as one of the brand's most interesting and unique cars. It was not the fastest, but it gave Skoda a whole new image. It looked cool, it handled well for its time, and it led to some of the most successful rally cars the company ever made. Not bad for a small coupe from a country behind the Iron Curtain. In the late 1960s, something unexpected started taking shape in Quebec. While most Canadian cars followed the typical formula of big engines and heavy bodies, one small company decided to go in a completely different direction. It wanted to build a lightweight European-style sports car, right in Canada. This car was called the Manic GT. It was unusual, bold, and built by people who were not known for building cars at all. The name might sound like a rock band or an energy drink, but this was a real car, and its story is one of ambition, problems, and a very short production run. The Manic GT was created by Jacques About, a French-born Canadian who worked in public relations for Renault Canada. Jacques About was a big fan of sports cars, especially the Alpine A110. But when Renault refused to bring the Alpine to North America, Jacques took matters into his own hands. He decided to build a Canadian version. He started a company called Les Automobiles Manic Inc. in 1968. The name Manic came from the Manicouagan River and Dam in Quebec, which was known for its massive hydroelectric power. Jacques thought it sounded powerful and very Canadian. To make this dream real, Jacques About teamed up with designer Serge Soumille. Serge had experience in automotive styling and helped create the shape of the Manic GT. The design was based on the Renault 8 chassis, but with a fiberglass body attached directly to the frame. This helped reduce weight and gave the car a sporty, low-slung look. It was a two-door coupe that looked a bit like a European berlinette, with pop-up headlights and a curvy rear end. Even though it was small, the Manic GT had some clever engineering. Under the rear hood, the car used a Renault Cléonfonte inline-4 engine. Buyers could choose between different versions. The base model had 65 horsepower, the mid-level had 80 horsepower, and the most powerful one had 105 horsepower. The standard gearbox was a 4-speed manual, but a 5-speed was also available. The Manic GT weighed about 1,450 pounds, so even with modest power, it felt quick. The top speed was around 135 miles per hour depending on the engine. It had independent suspension, rack and pinion steering, and 4-wheel disc brakes, which was pretty advanced for a Canadian car at the time. The car was first built in Terrebonne, Quebec in 1969, and later production moved to Granby. Jacques planned to make 2,000 cars a year. He set up sales through Renault dealers in Canada and even some in the United States. But things quickly started to fall apart. Renault started phasing out its rear-engine cars, which made parts harder to get. The company had financial problems, especially since it depended heavily on Renault's support. By 1971, only about 160 cars had been built, and production stopped completely. Today, fewer than 40 Manic GTs are known to still exist. Some are kept in museums like the Canadian Automotive Museum. Others are owned by collectors. Even though the Manic GT did not last long, it remains one of the only sports cars ever designed and built in Canada. And for a brief moment, Jacques About showed that even a small group in Quebec could try to build something different. In the early 1980s, a strange and clever little car rolled out of a French factory. It had a mid-engine, 3 seats across the front, and body panels that would never rust. It was called the Matra Murena, and unless you lived in Europe or read deep into car magazines, you probably never heard of it. But behind that wedge-shaped body was a story filled with experiments, problems, and a few surprises, like a Formula One engine in a family-sized sports car. The Matra Murena was built in France by a company called Matra with help from Talbot, part of the PSA group that also owned Peugeot and Citroën. It replaced the Matra Simca Baghira, a car that had cool ideas but was famous for rusting faster than it drove. So, Matra took a new approach. They designed a galvanized steel chassis, making it the first production car to be completely dipped in zinc to prevent rust. Then they added 12 fiberglass body panels made using a method called SMC, or sheet molding compound. That made the Murena both light and resistant to corrosion. The Murena came with 3 engine choices. The basic 1.6-liter 4-cylinder from the Talbot Solara made 92 horsepower and reached about 113 miles per hour. A better option was the 2.2-liter engine from the Talbot Tagora, which pushed out 118 horsepower and could go up to 122 miles per hour. But the rarest version was the Murena 2.2S, also known as the Preparation 1 42. It had twin Solex carburetors and made 142 horsepower. That one could hit 130 miles per hour and did 0 to 60 in about 8.4 seconds. Not bad for a car with 3 seats across the front. And yes, about those seats. The Murena had a driver's seat and 2 passenger seats side by side. All were separate and could be adjusted individually. You could even fold down the middle one and turn it into an armrest if nobody was sitting there. It was an odd idea, but it gave the car a very roomy feeling without taking up too much space. The Murena also shared a bunch of parts with other cars in the PSA family. It borrowed its gearbox from the Citroën CX, some parts from the Talbot Horizon, door handles from the Renault 12, and even the steering rack from the Peugeot 505. The front suspension had torsion bars, while the back used coil springs. Only about 10,680 Murenas were built from 1980 to 1983. Matra stopped production when they made a deal with Renault to build the first generation of the Renault Espace minivan. That project needed all of Matra's resources, so the Murena was quietly retired. There were some strange versions made for racing too. One car had a Matra Formula 1 V12 engine stuffed in the back. Another version, created with Jean-Pierre Beltoise, had wide fenders and 184 horsepower. And then there was the Chaperon Chimère, which had a removable roof and was shown at the 1982 Paris Motor Show by coach builder Henri Chaperon. In the end, the Matra Murena was not a huge success in sales, but it tried some bold ideas. It aimed to solve the problems of rust and space in a clever way. It might have looked like a science project, but at least it was one that ran.